Today's lecture centers around 4 questions. The first being, does personality exist? Are we unique individuals? Do we have unique personalities? That's one of the questions I mean here. The other question I mean is, does my personality matter? That is, am I stable? Do I have a stable pattern of psychology across situations? My second question is, what causes personality? You're going to see it's complicated. We probably think personality is caused by our genes. Maybe it's caused by our society. Maybe it's caused by us and our choices. The third question is, what is the function of personality for our species? When I think about this question, I think, wouldn't my life be a lot easier if everybody thought exactly like me? In terms of my own daily life, I think it would be. I'd be able to know what would make people laugh, what would make people sad, what would be the best way to present information to everyone. Right? Wouldn't that just be easier if I could walk in a room and know how to make friends? Because everybody liked what I liked, everybody thought the way I thought, everybody reacted the way I reacted. Well, this clearly isn't the case, so it makes me pull out some evolutionary roots and ask, well, is there a function to having different personalities? What do we as a group of people, or as a species, or as an animal get out of the fact that we have different personalities? My fourth question is personality important? And what do I mean here? Does personality predict behavior? That if it doesn't, then honestly, I don't really care that much. Does personality exist? What does that even mean? This guy has personality. Well, that's not what we're talking about in psychology, even though The Rock is a great guy, right? All that means is I like somebody. So that's not the kind of personality we're talking about. We are asking the question, I like to think I'm a unique human, unlike any other human in the world, but is that true? Right? Like that's one of the questions I mean. Are humans actually unique? When I ask the question, does personality exist? I'm asking, do we have a set of shared traits that construct the most common types of human personality? So the way I like to think about this is with a baking analogy. So if you make bread, you need flour, you need yeast, you need baking soda. So, and you got different types of breads. You got biscuits, you got waffles, you got pancakes, you got actual bread, you got rolls. Do we have traits? Like, we all have traits. Are there core traits that we all have, like bread, like yeast, like baking powder, that we have in different amounts that turn us into different kinds of breads? So the question when I say, does personality exist? Do we have a core set of personality traits that are the most important that make us human? So ultimately, when we think about personality in our field, we think personality is a characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Characteristic pattern is the important choice of words here. It's characteristic. It's basically always present a little extreme, so mostly present. Do I have a mostly present pattern of psychology, thinking, feeling, and behaving? Now, in terms of this question, there is a tug of war in the field. Now, this tug of war, when we're asking, does personality exist, is a tug of war between the question, are humans unique, and the other question, are humans made up of core personality traits, just in different amounts, like my bread analogy. Well, these different approaches have been around since the 1920s, and we still haven't figured it out. The one approach is the idiographic approach, and that's the unique personality approach. That's trying to describe a human in their unique way. What's my unique way of being? The nomothetic approach is not about unique individuals, but it's about the discovering those amounts of traits that we have, those most important traits that make us human, those most important traits that create our human personalities. The nomothetic approach is really the trait approach. It's trying to figure out what are the most important traits that describe humanity, and can we understand one's personality by describing these components? Now, these two different approaches have two different ways of assessing them. One is more scientific than the other. So, the ideographic approach I find more comforting as a human being. I'm like, yes, I want to know if I'm unique. I want to know how I'm unique. I want to know why I'm unique. But we don't have methods to really examine this. Our best methods are qualitative research, where we take one's biography and try to deduce their personality from their biography. So you need a personality scientist. You need them to spend days, maybe weeks with a person. You need to take their biography. You need to try to understand their personality. Well, that's a qualitative approach, and it's going to be very difficult to interpret those biographies, those descriptions. Outside of that qualitative approach, we have no way to assess the question, are humans actually unique? So I want you to hold that in your mind. Now, the nomothetic approach uses quantitative analysis. What we do is we provide people questionnaires, and we assess their personality on these questionnaires, or we assess their behavior, or we assess others' opinions of their personality. But ultimately, you have a quantitative question and a qualitative question. Are humans unique? That's a question we can't really answer with our current methods, and you're going to have to figure out future methods to investigate that, and that's my challenge to future personality psychologists. Now, with the quantitative approach, it's easy. We have these measures, we have these tools, we have these mathematical tools that allow us to identify those core human traits. Now, both of these ideas have two different applications. The ideographic approach is applied to therapy and self-improvement. If you can know thyself, you can free thyself from thyself, right? That's a very important thing. So the goal is maybe to change yourself to live your best life, or to engage with your personality, to interact with your situation so you can live your best life. That's a very noble goal, and it's a goal that I wish we focused on more in the field. Instead, the application of the nomothetic approach is more about our relationship to our work. So, and if you look at the history of personality, this is where it started. So I'm not making this up, but I want to find the right job for me. So I take a personality test. What jobs fit my personality? I want to find the right spouse for me. We both take a personality test. Do we match up well? What are the best people to match up together to, have a good relationship, or even maybe the same idea, but for coworkers, right? Who do you want on your team? Ultimately, we're focusing on ways to be productive and rich. And when you think about another aspect of application, it's, well, I have these aspects of my personality that don't fit my job or that don't fit my relationship. Can I change them? How do I change them to be more effective, more productive? So you have two different approaches, one that's more soulful, for real, and one that's more applied to be successful in our world, right? Well, ultimately, one of these has received more attention and more power, and that's the nomothetic approach. And it might be because it is serving these desires, these needs, these capitalist functions, but it also, it simply is scientific. You can examine these questions with scales and measures and statistics. With the nomothetic approach, it's currently impossible, with the ideographic approach, it's impossible to actually examine the question, are humans unique? Because we don't have the methods for an individualized psychology. Psychology's methods are all based on the average. So, of course, the nomothetic approach is currently dominant in the field, not only because it's doable, but also I think because it is very much in line with the folks that fund our research. The U.S. government, corporations, they want to know how to make humans more productive, more effective. Me as a person, right? I'm going to engage with my therapist, engage with an ideographic approach, learn thyself, know thyself, free thyself from thyself, right? Like, that's going to be my personal goal. But it'd be nice if the next generation of scientists, you, can solve this riddle. How do we have an ideographic approach to personality that is also scientific? So what have we gained from the nomothetic approach? Number one, we found the core building blocks of humanity. They're called the big 5 personality traits. Now, this is the result of 100 years of research on dictionaries using math. What do I mean by there? There's an assumption in how we found these traits. That assumption is that language covers all aspects that are important for other human beings, including personality. So how do we do this research? We started with dictionaries. We found all the adjectives. We had people come in and rate other people on these adjectives that they knew clearly. We applied math to these ratings, and we looked for clusters. We found the 5 clusters of openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. The book does a great job of explaining these, right? But they're also kind of self-explanatory. How open are you to new things? How much comfort do you take in old things? Conscientiousness, how dutiful are you? How detail-oriented are you? How organized are you versus maybe not so much? Extroversion, this one's a little bit more difficult, but in general, it involves things like how much do you process information externally with others? How much energy do you gain when you interact with others? And clearly a level of gregariousness and enjoyment with interacting with others versus introversion, which you get energy internally, you're focused internally, and like your focus isn't external, it's internal. And, you're a little less gregarious, a little less, that sort of aspect of who you are. Now, I just want to say about introverts and extroverts. Introverts, a lot of people say they're introverts when they're really simply shy of speaking in public, and those are two different things. Focus on that internal processing. How much are you in your own head? How much energy do you get by being inside your own head? How much energy do you lose, not by the fear of public speaking, but by interacting with your friends? If like hanging out with your best friends is a little bit of an energy suck for you, you're probably an introvert. If hanging out with your best friends is great, you can do it all night, even if you don't say much, you're engaging in some extroverted behavior there. So my point here is just as a teacher, introverts speak in class. They really do. They don't speak as much as extroverts, but what they do is they provide often this great insight. Because they've been processing all this information internally and focusing internally, that they've spent a lot of time with this idea, and then when they come out, it shows that they've spent time on this idea. Now, when extroverts like myself, we talk out loud, like I'm doing right now, and I process information out loud. Not everything I say is a profound insight, right? Because some of the work I'm doing cognitively is happening outside of my mouth right now. But introverts do talk. Agreeableness, in general, like how important is it for you to have, positive, happy, smooth relationships with another human being? I'll give you an example. When you're at Thanksgiving and somebody says something that's clearly trying to start a debate or a fight or whatever, do you ignore it because that's better for the relationship, or do you engage in the debate because maybe that's better for your personal ideas? Maybe it's important to express who you are to others, right? These are things you got to think about. Like agreeableness, people that are high in agreeableness are going to sacrifice that debate for that relationship any day of the week. Neuroticism is just another word for emotional reactivity. If you're in a situation, how reactive are you to it? Do you experience a lot of empathy? Do you experience a lot of fear? Do you experience a lot of something bad happens and it's like boom, a lot of emotion, right? Are you those are important components of human personality. And what does it lead to? Row your canoe in the ocean, okay? OCEANCANOE. All right? It'll help you remember these traits. What is the evidence that these traits exist? Basically, we've done this dictionary research in numerous places, numerous languages, numerous people, numerous times, and we find these 5 traits cluster out. So that's number 1. Number 2, these 5 traits cluster out and predict behavior in all these places, and that's important. We believe as scientists right now that these are the 5 core building blocks of human personality. If humans were bread, these are our flour, these are our baking soda, this is our yeast, this is our kneading, this is our water, right? You put it together in different amounts. Sometimes you get biscuits, sometimes you get waffles, sometimes, I guess I'm thinking about breakfast, sometimes you get bread. Now, the nomothetic approach has led to an interesting innovation in the last 10 years, I guess 15 years, called the dark triad typology. Now, what's a typology? You have traits, right? You can see some on the big 5 on the right, or on the left, excuse me. How these traits combine to create a person is a typology. So essentially, the dark triad is a series of 3 traits that make a typology that we don't have a name for. We just call it the common and aversive human personality type. So I want to talk about these 3 traits. Essentially, these are non-clinical traits. These are traits that are aversive but present in people in a clinical manner. There is not a personality disorder here, but these traits exist and predict some interesting behaviors. What are the traits? Narcissism, a very high, inflated sense of self. Machiavellianism, that is using others to get what you want. And psychopathy, which is, and to many degrees, enjoying the pain of others. Now, if you have a very highly inflated sense of self, you are using other people to get what you want, and you're not sensitive to their pain, that's going to lead to a specific set of behaviors. What are those behaviors? Actually, these folks become bosses quite often, and they become bad bosses. So, there's a lot of work behaviors that are predicted by the dark triad. If you're high in the dark triad, you're less likely to help. You're more likely to be a bad boss. You're more likely to get ahead of any means possible because other people's pain doesn't impact you. We've all kind of had an interaction with someone like this. It predicts relationship behavior. So if you think about mating, you can look for love, you can, look for sex, you can worry about other people's feelings. You may want love and have these personality traits, but you may want love from someone who is married. Well, these folks with these traits, with this dark triad, are more likely to steal one's spouse. They're more likely to engage in short-term mating and lying during mating. Things like this are all part of the dark triad. Predicts prejudice, predicts just general selfish behavior. So when we look at the dark triad, it's this aversive human personality found through the nomothetic approach. These are core personality traits. They're not at the degree of the personality traits we just described, the big five, but they're there. And they describe a specific type of person, the dark triad. Now, you may find that you have some of these personality traits. We all do. I have a little, I can admit I have a little bit of narcissism from time to times, not at the clinical level, but like on one of these scales, sure. I got a little bit of narcissism there, right? But we really got to think about the fact that these personality traits don't completely determine our behavior, but they make certain behaviors more likely. And I do believe we can reduce our narcissism. We can definitely reduce our Machiavellian focus. We don't need to use other people's to get ahead. And we can definitely learn to be sensitive to the pain of others, right? But for some people, this isn't as natural as it is for others. And I think that's the important aspect of personality. Think about these traits. Look at the behaviors they lead to and ask yourself, is this the kind of person I want to become? Because in your 20s, your personality is still developing, right? Personality is complicated, and we're going to learn that in a moment. There's also the faux personality trait, the Myers-Briggs, that a lot of us, I'm calling it faux. It's not very scientifically valid. There's other scientists that argue this, but you could be the architect, the logician, the commander, the debater. This is the most common personality test that most of my students are aware of. Now, ultimately, it's really just a combination of introversion, extroversion, and the Barnum Effect. What's the Barnum Effect? Now, the Barnum Effect is the fact that humans believe general descriptions that apply to nearly everyone, but they believe they apply to themselves. So if I just give you a general description that applies to nearly everyone, you're going to believe it applies to you. So you see this in horoscopes. Barnum is from Barnum and Bailey Circus. Maybe you've heard of that, maybe you haven't. But this was a vaudeville show person that was able, to sell things to people that they didn't need at all. Okay, but I want you to look at these descriptions. I'm not saying these are the official Myers-Briggs descriptions, but these are some you'll see on the internet. Imaginative and strategic thinker with a plan for everything. Oh, totally describes me. That's me. I'm imaginative. I'm a strategic thinker. I have a plan for things. Innovative inventors with an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. Am I going to admit that I'm not innovative, that I'm not an inventor? Maybe not an inventor, but am I going to admit that I have a quenchable thirst for knowledge, or I have no thirst for knowledge? Am I the commander? I'm bold, imaginative, and strong. Am I going to admit to being weak, uncreative, and the opposite of bold, like meek? A strong-willed leader. Am I a weak-willed leader? No. Always finding a way. Well, I've survived life so far, so I found a way this far. Or making one. Yes, that's the same thing. Am I going to say I've never found my way? No, I live my life every day. Or am I smart? Am I going to admit to being unintelligent, curious? Am I going to admit to being not curious, thinker, not a thinker, who cannot resist an intellectual challenge? Who can resist intellectual challenges? No one's going to admit. Like all these descriptions describe me. So if you tell me I took a test and you give me one, I'm like, oh yes, that's me. But the other three describe me as well. So be careful here. The Myers-Briggs is not the most valid personality assessment tool that exists. And it's really just an assessment, in my opinion, of introversion and extroversion. So the previous traits were all focused on what are the core components of the human personality. There's a lot of us that study personality type traits that we don't take it that serious. We're not, like, I'm part of this group. We don't focus on identifying what are those core components of the human personality. That's not what we're interested in at all. We're interested in individual differences. So you remember all those adjectives from the dictionary, right? Well, we're interested in how those adjectives predict behavior, and we don't care if those adjectives are core to the human personality experience. We just care that they exist. And we call these individual differences. By saying they're individual differences, we're saying they're not core parts of the human personality. So we're making no assumption of a taxonomy. We're making no assumption of different traits. We're not going into either of those worlds. We're just saying some people have a high IQ, some people have a low IQ. How does that impact behavior? Some people have a lot of prejudice, some people have less. How does that impact their behavior? Some people have a lot of empathy, some people have less. How does that impact their behavior? Some people are easily disgusted, some people aren't. How does that impact their behavior? Some people are politically conservative, some people are liberal. How does that impact their behavior? We don't really put this in that greater typology of what is the core human experience. What are the core personality traits within there? What are these different types of people? And to me, this is the most useful way to think about personality for scientists, right? Whatever you're doing, whether you're creating a manipulation or you're doing some experiment, you want to think about, well, who's this experiment going to impact the most? And you want to measure that individual difference of that person that you think it's going to impact the most, right? Also, you want to think about, well, some people are, like, I'm trying to create empathy. Okay, some people are coming in with a high empathy. Who's my experiment going to impact the least, right? I want to kind of test, like, well, I definitely want to measure individual differences on empathy in both these situations, because there are going to be people that are more impacted by my empathy manipulation than others. Is it those with high empathy? Is it those with low empathy? So let me show you one of these scales, the IRI, the Davis's IRI. It's just a measure of one's individual differences on empathy. It has 4 different components. The first component is called fantasy. You can look at the question. It says, I daydream and fantasize with some regularity about things that might happen to me. Okay. That's an individual difference. Some people fantasize more than others. Why is that important for empathy? If we can fantasize, we can fantasize about other people's emotions. That's the general idea. Perspective taking. I sometimes find it difficult to see things from the other guy's point of view. It's like if you are low on this and say it's easy for you to take someone else's perspective, guess what? It's going to be easy for you to experience empathy for them. Empathic concern, that's the emotional response. The perspective taking is the cognitive response. So sometimes I don't feel very sorry for other people when they're having problems, right? Or I often have tender, concerned feelings for people less fortunate than me. What's going on there? It's about my feelings. It's about my response to the pain of others. Empathic concern, the emotional response. Personal distress is when the emotional response goes wrong. In emergency situations, I feel apprehensive and ill at ease. Part of empathy is having a very highly sensitive, emotional response. Well, that highly sensitive emotional response can cause you to fall apart sometimes. So this component, personal distress, gets at that. These individual differences are important for my research, understanding who's more susceptible to empathy than others. I study empathy, if you haven't figured that out. So, in terms of the first question, does personality exist? Do people have a stable, unique way to approach life? Yeah, I'd say sometimes we do, right? Do we think about life, act in life, feel in response to life in a stable way? Yeah, we have evidence that this sometimes does exist. So I would say personality does exist in that regard. Do humans have a core set of traits that are important in every human society organization? This is the one I'm most comfortable saying. Yes, the big five exist. Do humans have individual differences in ability, reactivity, and interpersonal style? Definitely. That's the one that's the least controversial. Yes, and the most useful to scientists. Are humans actually unique? We do not have the scientific methods to examine this. I believe we are, and it's your generation of scientists. I hope someone in this room decides to become a personality psychologist and solve this question, because this is the most important question in the field. We're at the end of section 1, and we're going to talk about the causes of personality. What causes personality? I have a few ideas. First idea is culture. Where did I get this cultural idea from? Number one, there are lots of cross-cultural studies that show this similar finding. But we've looked at America versus Japan a lot. That's one of the most common cross-cultural comparisons. And what have we found? Well, we found that Americans have a higher level of extroversion and a lower level of introversion, and Japanese have a higher level of introversion and a lower level of extroversion. And we're like, why? A lot of people are like, what's the genetic factor? There's not a genetic factor here. That's what I'll tell you straight off the bat. It's not genetics. What we think it is the structure of society. So I want to give you 2 proverbs that we give children. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. This is one I heard, but my students are telling me they're hearing less and less. So maybe you're hearing this less and less, but it means speak up or be uncomfortable. So the squeaky wheel gets the grease. You got to speak up to get what you want. That's an American proverb. A similar but very different Japanese proverb is the nail that stands up gets hammered down. Don't be the squeaky wheel, right? If something's uncomfortable and you stick out, you're going to get the hammer, and that's not the best way to approach life. What you need to realize here is there's 2 different definitions of maturity. In the United States, maturity is standing out, finding your own self, moving away from your parents, things like that. But it's developing this individual sense of self. Speaking up for yourself is mature. In Japan, maturity is more viewed as fulfilling your duties, doing your obligations, doing what's expected of you, not expressing your negative affect when something isn't going right. That's viewed as immature. So one of the very components of being an extrovert is expressing your internal desires externally. Well, that's viewed immature in your society. Guess what? You're going to learn to not express that personality trait. You're going to learn to, it's just not going to develop. Some may view it as suppression. I just view it as not developing. So ultimately, we have 2 different cultures. One culture favors extroversion, one favors introversion, and you learn those different traits due to the different definitions of maturity. So culture impacts your personality. We know that for a fact. Motives. I love the idea of motives. This is an old one. This is like probably the main idea in the 50s. Let's say 60s and 70s. So if you think about it, it's very tricky and scientifically creative. What drives behavior? Your motives, your motivation, your goals. So, if we look at your motives and you have a specific consistent motive, if you are motivated to find love and to belong, you're going to treat people differently than if you're motivated to get ahead and be rich and find power. If you're motivated to find meaning, in truth, you're going to have different responses to situations than other people. Right? Even think about this in the classroom. If you're motivated to make friends and find love, you're probably cracking jokes. If you're motivated to be rich and find power, you're probably finding loopholes in the syllabus. If you're motivated to find meaning, you're probably just you're the weird kid asking all the questions, trying to figure out the meaning of life, right? Like, those different motives, who knows where they come from? Who cares? Those are going to predict your behavior, your personality, your consistent way of being. So it's kind of a tricky and interesting way to think about it. But yes, of course, our motivations, our motives, our goals are going to predict our consistent way of thinking, feeling, and acting. Another thing that causes your personality is your self-definition. You look in the mirror and you say, I am this, I am that. Who are you? And I'm just going to do this for myself. Well, I can say I am a man, I am a professor. Those are 2 parts of my identity. Then I look to my world and I say, what does a man or a professor do? Men do this, professors, do that. And then I say, well, that's how I should act, right? So I'm like, oh, men should act this way, right? Professors should act this way, and I try to conform. Now, if we look at the gender piece of this, right, you go back to my grandparents. Like, my grandparents looked at the gender roles and said, I'm a man, I'm a woman. My society tells me to act this way. This is how I'm going to act. And that's how they did act. And, I'm glad to see things are changing, but I also want to point out that we are changing the societal definition of what it means to be a man, right? We have pointed out this thing we call toxic masculinity, but to my grandfather, that was just masculinity, right? And I want you to see that, by changing these cultural definitions, the hope is that we change our definitions of ourselves. But ultimately, where's my personality come from? How I identify myself, and these self-fulfilling prophecies, these society-driven ideas come together for me to construct who I am and how I act. If I try to be something, eventually over time I will become that thing. Past history is another cause of one's personality. We've kind of seen that in the cultural example. This is the main idea of the behaviorists, and they use the Baby Albert study to consistently say, like, look, we can create personalities. We made this kid anxious, at least towards these furry white things. We made him anxious in general too, through our reward punishment contingencies. So your past history of rewards and punishments is going to construct your personality. That's the behaviorist argument. The most common argument, or I guess the most desirable argument that personality psychologists, I think most personality psychologists want to make, is that genes create personality. And you see this in the book when they're talking about the twin studies. They're like, 50% of personality is heritable. What they're saying is that personality is caused by your genes. But I want you to go out and I want you to think more critically and creatively. What do we know about adoption? Maybe you don't know much, but if you research it or talk to anybody, you're going to know that it ain't cheap, it's expensive. So, we have a bunch of people who are rich adopting kids. That's an environmental similarity. But when we do these heritability studies, we assume that the two kids raised by two different parental environments have two completely different environments. But we know they're at least both wealthy. We know that for a fact. Talk to anybody who's gone through an adoption. It's not cheap. Also, when you go through an adoption, people, talk to you and examine your home life and look at the stability of your relationship. So if they are effective, you're also in a stable home with a stable relationship where there's love, where there's employment, right? Those are similarities that are going to be shared across these twins that are reared apart. Now, a lot of the twin studies that we still report, the twins were adopted in the 50s, right? Or 60s, or even 70s, when a lot of the adoption agencies were focused on religion. And back then, if you weren't of that religion, you weren't going to have the children to adopt. And so now we got another similarity, a similar religion. And also, like, going back to that time, it's only been in recent history where, gay couples have been allowed to adopt by these agencies. So now we're talking about kids who are assumed to have a completely different environment, but are raised by rich, stable, loving, employed, Christian, heterosexual couples. That's a lot of levels of similarity. That's more levels of similarity than I use in my experiments, okay? That's a lot of similarity right there. To assume that those environments are completely different is a bad assumption. And yes, they've corrected some of their statistical methods, but I'm skeptical of these corrections. But ultimately, this idea that 50% of personality is inherited is off. And I'll tell you why it's off. Because in the 90s, we developed the ability to sequence the human genome. And when we look at studies that predict the level of personality that's driven by genes, or the level of behavior that's driven by genes and personality, what do we find? We find about only 4% of that personality is driven by genetic influence. So, the scientist in me wants to point something out to you. There are good measures and there are bad measures. And there are okay measures and better measures. Heritability is a fine idea. There's a level of truth to it. There are twins reared apart do have 100% genetic similarity. But right? If I want to examine genetic similarity, why don't I just do it directly with the human genome? And when I do that and I find a drastically different result, am I going to trust the better measure, the one that directly examines the human genome? Or am I going to trust the worse measure, the one that assumes genomic similarity through assumptions? I'm going to choose the better measure. And what we see here is that your personality isn't 50% predicted by your genes. I'm going to argue that to the end of the earth, okay? We have the ability to measure your genes. We're not seeing that level of correlation. It's much smaller, near 4%. So to end this section, what causes personality? Your biology, your culture, yourself, your history, all the things I said earlier. It's not just genes. It's not even 50% genes. This is the end of section 2. I'm now going to focus on what is the function of personality. So this is actually, I'm recording this on Tuesday of the election. This is the voting day. And this is in my mind. And I'm not going to shy away from a question like this. But ultimately, what's the function of different personalities or even individual differences for the human species? Remember, I said political conservatism and liberalism, it is an individual difference. We'll talk about it like a personality in a moment. But when I look at the division in our society, wouldn't our lives be easier if we were just all the same? Right? We have people in our streets arguing, which I'm okay with that. Debating, I'm okay with that. But there's been acts of violence and murder that have been committed across political protesters in this year. And it's been a really difficult, rough year for us as a nation. And it leads me to think, well, wouldn't it just be easier if we all thought the same way? What is the function of having different, political individual differences if it's leading to such turmoil? How are we going to come together? Can we come together? Like, it seems to me that we all should just agree, right? Which it also seems to me that we're all trying to make everybody else agree with us as well. But I do see if we all shared the same opinions and so forth, we wouldn't be engaged in the violence that scares me, the violence that has taken lives in our nation. So I do wonder, what's the function of personality? Let's move outside of the political domain for just one moment and say, well, is the same personality going to be the best leader for these kids, the best leader for these folks in the boardroom, and the best leader for these juggalos at the gathering? Right? And then it's like, oh yes, there's different situations, different types of people, in this case, different leadership situations that are going to necessitate different leadership styles and different leadership personalities or different leadership individual differences. So there's something about having different personalities that's protective. It allows you to have different people be effective in different situations. So I'm there with you. I'm there with this idea. It's starting to convert me a little bit. And it leads me to think about, finding God in all things, the Jesuit value. So if I take this to its most extreme value, I'm like, well, if God had a hand in making our personalities, why would God give us all these different personalities? Is it possible that if we combine our different personalities, we end up being stronger? So does diversity make us stronger? Finding God in all things. Finding God in this political division. Can I find God in this political division with the science of psychology? In fact, I can. John Haidt is the expert on political theorizing and the political personality. So, John Haidt has identified two different political personality types. Of course, they're liberals and conservatives, right? But what does Haidt say about what is the makeup of these people? Haidt says that liberals' general approach to the system is that it needs to be changed when it oppresses and harms vulnerable groups. So in Haidt's world, liberals are focused on, oppression, those that are vulnerable, and getting rid of systems, political systems that harm others. Conservative groups conservative personality, on the other hand, excuse me, their focus is the general maintenance of the social order. And they're like, look, yes, some people are oppressed, some people don't, or if some don't admit it, but many do. They're like, look, not everybody benefits from this system, right? But currently it's a system we have, and it's clearly working. So we don't want to throw out this system. That's the general idea. That's the general difference in approach. It's like system maintenance on the conservative side. We have it. We want to maintain order. Like, okay, we don't want to lose that. And on the liberal side, it's like, this isn't working, let's change it. Now let's talk about that. Both of these ideologies, personality types, whatever you want to call them, have advantages. Now think about this. If you have a government where they don't have liberals making decisions, don't have people watching out for marginalized groups, what you're going to end up with something like the French Revolution, right? Where eventually the people that are being governed get so angry, and rightfully so, that revolution happens and the entire system crumbles. And when that system crumbles, it's not a good time. People suffer, people die, people starve. It's not very simple. It's not an easy answer. We can look at what happens when you don't have, we can also take this to another extreme. What happens when you don't have people with conservative or traditional values in place, right? What would happen then? So, hypothetically, I can't think of a actual political example where this has happened, but you can think of it like if everything was consistently changing all over time. Like 1 week, my syllabus changed. The next week, it changed again. The next week, it changed again. Okay, that's kind of true, right? But like when that happens, it's difficult to be successful, right? Look at what happened when we went online. Boom, everything changes overnight. How do we engage? How do I make sure students are engaged, right? I still haven't figured that out. How do students stay motivated and learn, right? We're all still struggling here. The system changed, and now all of a sudden we're not learning as effectively. Like, this is kind of the danger of just changing everything when you find a problem. So Haidt's idea is like human societies have formed and genetically formed. I mean, partly genetic, clearly 4%, but there's some genetic component to it, but there's some survival component to this. When you're trying to govern a group of humans, you got to change what harms the most vulnerable, and you got to keep in place what works. So you need to have these two pulls, right? These two extreme poles pulling against each other to make the best decisions. So in Haidt's world, the political compromises that we're not willing to make in this modern America is what we need to develop a better society. That's Haidt's argument. I'm just going to leave it there for you to think about. It's your decision to think about this with the compromise aspect. But if you look at our current system, and now we have social structures in place that suggest compromising with somebody from another political party is ridiculous, is silly, should never be engaged in. We're seeing this in the way our politics is playing out with our politicians. What's happening, right? It's becoming a power play. Our society's becoming fragile. This is not good. And I just want to point that out. Like, according to Haidt, this is not good. And Haidt is predicting what's happening today in America from like 10, 15 years ago when these ideas were first coming out. I'll let you sit with them and think about them, right? But it's these two different personality types plus compromise leading to a better society. So what's the function of these different personalities that appear to be creating struggle in our world, right? Well, you can create a better society through diversity. That's the idea. Through our different personalities, we can find God in creating different personalities. If we work together and share our ideas, I've given the example from political behaviors, we can create a better society. And that's the hope that John Haidt gives us. A lot of people view Haidt's research as like liberals are this way, conservatives are that way. For me, it helps me understand what other people are focused on. And I hope the research helps them understand what I'm focused on, right? Like what I care about, what my values are, what they care about, what their values are different, right? And they're coming from different places of focus and different, what Haidt would call different personalities. I would call individual differences. But ultimately, if we can work together, the idea is that we will build a better, stronger community. This is the end of section 3. So our fourth and final question is, does personality predict behavior? Which is seems like a very innocuous question, but this question nearly destroyed the entire field of personality in 1968 when Walter Mischel made an interesting discovery. Walter Mischel looked at all the research that looked at personality traits and their relationship or correlation with behavior. And he found correlations between zero point 0.2 and zero point 0.3. So this is the range of possible correlations that with which personality predicts behavior. Now, you probably don't understand what that means. To understand a correlation, you got to square it. So 0 0.2 squared is 0.04, 0 0.3 squared is 0.09. You got to understand that's a percentage. So it tells you the percentage of behavior that was related to personality traits, or the percentage of behavior that was related to personality. So only 4 to 9% of behavior is associated with personality traits. That's extremely low. So you can start to see, oh, why did this finding almost destroy the field? But you also might be saying, well, 4 and 9% is better than nothing. But you also got to realize 9% means 91% is not caused by personality. And the way we think about personality in American psychology is that it should be a much stronger predictor of behavior. At least we did. And if you look at our funding, we spend much more than 9% of our funding on personality predicting behavior. So where it seemed like it was a waste. But also, you got to understand, in 1965, we discovered something called correspondent inference, or the fundamental attribution error. And what it showed us at that time was that people, we've now learned it really applies to folks from Western, like the Western civilization, like the United States and Britain and things like that. But we found that people have a tendency to blame behavior on personality, even when it's clear that personality is not driving that behavior. Now, I'm not going to go into the methods of those studies, but what you need to see here is when you discover that personality psychologists are overestimating the amount that personality predicts behavior, right? And really it predicts very little behavior. What you're saying is that personality psychologists are biased. They were not engaging in objective science. They were not really being good scientists. And that's the argument that came out. It was like, oh, these scientists are engaging in correspondent inference, or the fundamental attribution error, at a level of their entire science. Thus, these scientists are not objective. They're not being trained to be objective. Thus, they're not trustworthy. That's why this finding almost destroyed the field. And you got to understand, that's a blow to say that a group of psychologists are ambivalent, oblivious to their cognitive biases. So essentially what happened after this finding was that personality psychologists were attacked. This one finding nearly destroyed the field. If you can talk to anybody who went through this period, who was getting their PhD in the late 60s, they talk about this time like it was the end of the world. Jobs were going away. Departments were getting rid of the personality psychology sub-programs in their departments. Personality psychology was viewed as a joke at this time, and it was really damaging. You read about it in the textbooks, but if you can talk to somebody that went through this period, you're gonna see basically tears and frustration in their eyes. But after the tears and frustration kind of subsided, personality psychologists fought back. Dave Funder showed us that, looked at all social psychology. It was like, hey, social psychologists, we were really taking advantage of this. We were like, they're biased. They, the correspondent inference, social psychology is great. And Dave Funder was like, wait a minute, let's see what percentage of behavior situations predict in social psychology. Looking at all the literature, what did they find? The same correlation, 0.2 to 0.3, 4 to 9%. So you're like, wait, personality psychology is just as good as social. And the real takeaway here is maybe psychology doesn't currently have the best ability to predict behavior, which is a huge goal in the field. But it's a really hard goal. What we're learning, even now, that our methods aren't the best. They could be better. So, the personality psychologists start to fight back. And then personality psychologists tell us, did this study, Caspi, Elder, and Bem, 1987. It's a great study, not for necessarily the takeaway, but for its place in this, what we call the situationist debate. Right? Does personality predict behavior? Does the situation predict behavior? I would say Caspi, Elder, and Bem, who are Caspi and Bem are like two of my all-time favorite psychologists. I actually got to take a class with Avshalom Caspi. He's a really cool guy. But, ultimately, their research showed you know what? If we do better science and think about this in a more complicated way, we can predict more of behavior. So if we account for both the personality of the person and the environment, then we can predict behavior better. So what they looked at, you can see their results here. They were looking at personality as temperament in kids, particularly tempered tantrums in kids. So literally temperament, haha. But how much these predicted erratic work life in adulthood. So what they found was they looked at how this temperament impacted multiple situations that impacted the final sort of situation of one's work life. So one's temper tantrums predicts about 20%. Their personality predicts about 20% of their erratic work life. Their temper tantrums, though, also feed into their educational success and their occupational success directly. And what they found that, when you look at the effect of education on erratic work life, you get another 2.5%. When you look at occupational status, which is like, the kind of occupation you end up finding yourself in, right? That predicts the erratic work life really well as well. It counts for another 12% of behavior. So when we look at the impact of personality on predicting two other situations and those abilities of those two situations and those outcomes to predict work life, you get a much better understanding of a much better predictive ability that helps us understand that predicting human behavior is complicated. And if we account for both the situation and the person, in multiple situations in this case, if we do good science, we can predict behavior. And it's going to involve both personality and the situation. So what do we know? We know personalities and situations impact behavior both independently. We know situations are going to impact personalities differently. Some people, you can look at this in your own life and see the truth, but some people are selected out of social groups, cultures, and even societies because they're weird, right? Like, we're not a kind animal to those that are different from us in many ways. So, we got to think about that. Certain situations are going to impact personalities differently. You might start hiding your personality. You might start making it go away. But also personalities choose what situations you belong in. Think about that boardroom and the juggalos from earlier, right? There's some personality variables that are going to predict if you enter in a corporate boardroom and that's your life, or you enter into the gathering in the world of the juggalos, there's going to be some choice of situation that's driven by personality. But if we go back to Levine, my favorite theorist that I talked about in the social psych lecture, behavior is more complicated than just a few factors, and we need to understand the entire field. We need to understand all personality variables, all situations, all potential stressors and biological responses and all that. And then, only then, we'll be able to predict behavior. And this is the goal of the field, trying to figure out that equation that predicts behavior, trying to figure out all those variables that we need to predict my individual behavior, your individual behavior, every individual's behavior. That's the goal. But also, like, when we look at this controversy that almost ended the field of personality psychology, is it really surprising to us that behavior is a function of the personality and the environment? Is it really surprising to us behavior is a little bit nature and a little bit nurture? Is it really surprising to us that nurture and nature interact to predict behavior? Is it really surprising to us that behavior is complicated? No, no, and no. So does personality predict behavior? Well, I guess if you're doing good science, it does. Good science predicts behavior. Good science is complicated. Good science accounts for both the person and the environment. So when we finish on our 4 questions, does personality exist? Yeah, traits exist. We know the core traits. Do individual differences exist? Yes, individual differences exist. Do unique people exist? Maybe. We don't have the tools to assess that. And I think that's your helm. Your generation personality psychologists will start to solve this problem. Where do different personalities come from? Well, if you look back to that slide, it was culture, it was self, it was all this stuff. I'm going to say it's just a little bit of country, a little bit of rock and roll. No, I'm going to say it's a little bit of nature and a little bit of nurture. What is the function of personality or different personalities? We saw a case where diversity makes us stronger, protects our collective decision making, right? By having diverse perspectives and engaging in some level of interaction, thought, compromise, whatever you want to call it, we can make better decisions by working together and live better lives. And I think we need that lesson in our society today. Does personality predict behavior? Yeah, when you do good science. We just talked about that. I'm not going to go over that again. No better, no worse than anything else in our field, okay? And Levine says, be complicated when you're thinking about your science. Be complicated when you're thinking about your science.